Welcome to Thueringer for Farming Simulator 15. We now continue in our reading of My Antonia by Willa Cather in Book 2, Part 11. It was said he brushed them every night, as a woman does her hair. His white teeth looked factory-made. His skin was red and rough, as if from perpetual sunburn. He often went away to hot springs to take mud baths. He was notoriously dissolute with women. 2 Swedish girls who had lived in his house were the worse for the experience. One of them he had taken to Omaha and established in the business for which he had fitted her. He still visited her. Cutter lived in a state of perpetual warfare with his wife, and yet, apparently, they never thought of separating. They dwelt in a fussy scrollwork house, painted white and buried in thick evergreens, with a fussy white fence and barn. Cutter thought he knew a great deal about horses and usually had a colt which he was training for the track. On Sunday mornings one could see him out at the fairgrounds speeding around the racecourse in his trotting buggy, wearing yellow gloves and a black and white checked traveling cap, his whiskers blowing back in the breeze. If there were any boys about, Cutter would offer one of them a quarter to hold the stopwatch and then drive off, saying he had no change and would fix it up next time. No one could cut his lawn or wash his buggy to suit him. He was so fastidious and prim about his place that a boy would go to a good deal of trouble to throw a dead cat into his backyard or to dump a sackful of tin cans in his alley. It was a peculiar combination of old maidishness and licentiousness that made Cutter seem so despicable. He had certainly met his match when he married Mrs. Cutter. She was a terrifying-looking person, almost a giantess in height, raw-boned, with iron-gray hair, a face always flushed, and prominent hysterical eyes. When she meant to be entertaining and agreeable, she nodded her head incessantly and snapped her eyes at one. Her teeth were long and curved, like a horse's. People said babies always cried if she smiled at them. Her face had a kind of fascination for me. It was the very color and shape of anger. There was a gleam of something akin to insanity in her full, intense eyes. She was formal in manner and made calls in rustling, steel-gray brocades and a tall bonnet with a bristling aigrettes. Mrs. Cutter painted china so assiduously that even her wash bowls and pitchers and her husband's shaving mug were covered with violets and lilies. Once, when Cutter was exhibiting some of his wife's china to a caller, he dropped a piece. Mrs. Cutter put her handkerchief to her lips as if she were going to faint and said grandly, "Mr. Cutter, you have broken all the commandments. Spare the finger bowls." They quarreled from the moment Cutter came into the house until they went to bed at night, and their hired girls reported these scenes to the town at large. Mrs. Cutter had several times cut paragraphs about unfaithful husbands out of the newspapers and mailed them to Cutter in a disguised handwriting. Cutter would come home at noon, find the mutilated journal in the paper rack, and triumphantly fit the clipping into the space from which it had been cut. Those two could quarrel all morning about whether he ought to put on his heavy or his light underwear, and all evening about whether he had taken cold or not. The Cutters had major as well as minor subjects for dispute. The chief of these was the question of inheritance. Mrs. Cutter told her husband it was plainly his fault they had no children. He insisted that Mrs. Cutter had purposefully remained childless with a determination to outlive him and to share his property with her people, whom he detested. To this she would reply that unless he changed his mode of life, she would certainly outlive him. After listening to her insinuations about his physical soundness, Cutter would resume his dumbbell practice for a month, or rise daily at the hour when his wife most liked to sleep, dress noisily, and drive out to the track with his trotting horse. Once, when they had quarreled about household expenses, Mrs. Cutter put on her brocade and went among her friends soliciting orders for painted china, saying that Mr. Cutter had compelled her to live by her brush. Cutter wasn't shamed as she had expected. He was delighted. Cutter often threatened to chop down the cedar trees which half buried the house. His wife declared she would leave him if she were stripped of the privacy which she felt that those trees afforded her. That was his opportunity, surely, but he never cut down the trees. The Cutters seemed to find their relations to each other interesting and stimulating, and certainly the rest of us found them so. Wick Cutter was different from any other rascal I have ever known, but I have found Mrs. Cutters all over the world, sometimes founding new religions, sometimes being forcibly fed, easily recognizable even when superficially tamed. Part 12. After Antonia went to live with the Cutters, she seemed to care about nothing but picnics and parties and having a good time. When she was not going to a dance, she sewed until midnight. Her new clothes were the subject of caustic comment. Under Lena's direction, she copied Mrs. Gardner's new party dress and Mrs. Smith's street costume so ingeniously in cheap materials that those ladies were greatly annoyed, and Mrs. Cutter, who was jealous of them, was secretly pleased. Tony wore gloves now and high-heeled shoes and feathered bonnets, and she went downtown nearly every afternoon with Tiny and Lena and the Marshall's Norwegian Anna. We high school boys used to linger on the playground at the afternoon recess to watch them as they came tripping down the hill along the board sidewalk 2 and 2. They were growing prettier every day, but as they passed us, I used to think with pride that Antonia, like Snow White in the fairy tale, was still fairest of them all. Being a senior now, I got away from school early. Sometimes I overtook the girls downtown and coaxed them into the ice cream parlor where they would sit chattering and laughing, telling me all the news from the country. I remember how angry Tiny Soderball made me one afternoon. She declared she had heard her grandmother was going to make a Baptist preacher of me. "I guess you'll have to stop dancing and wear a white necktie then. Won't he look funny, girls?" Lena laughed. "You'll have to hurry up, Jim. If you're going to be a preacher, I want you to marry me. You must promise to marry us all and then baptize the babies." Norwegian Anna, always dignified, looked at her reprovingly. "Baptists don't believe in christening babies, do they, Jim?" I told her I didn't know what they believed and didn't care, and that I certainly wasn't going to be a preacher. "That's too bad," Tiny simpered. She was in a teasing mood. "You'd make such a good one. You're so studious. Maybe you'd like to be a professor. You used to teach Tony, didn't you?" Antonia broke in. "I've set my heart on Jim being doctor. You be good with sick people, Jim. Your grandmother's trained you up so nice. My papa always said you were an awful smart boy." I said I was going to be whatever I pleased. "Won't you be surprised, Miss Tiny, if I turn out to be a regular devil of a fellow?" They laughed until a glance from Norwegian Anna checked them. The high school principal had just come into the front part of the shop to buy bread for supper. Anna knew the whisper was going about that I was a sly one. People said there must be something queer about a boy who showed no interest in girls of his own age, but who could be lively enough when he was with Tony and Lena or the three Marys. The enthusiasm for the dance, which the Fannies had kindled, did not at once die out. After the tent left town, the Euchre Club became the Owl Club and gave dances in the Masonic Hall once a week. I was invited to join, but I declined. I was moody and restless at winter and tired of the people I saw every day. Charlie Harling was already at Annapolis while I was still sitting in Black Hawk, answering to my name at roll call every morning, rising from my desk at the sound of a bell, and marching out like the grammar school children. Mrs. Harling was a little cool toward me because I continued to champion Antonia. What was there for me to do after supper? Usually I had learned next day's lessons by the time I left the school building, and I couldn't sit still and read forever. In the evening I used to prowl about, hunting for diversion. There lay the familiar streets, frozen with snow or liquid with mud. They led to the houses of good people who were putting their babies to bed or simply sitting still before the parlor stove, digesting their supper. Black Hawk had two saloons. One of them was admitted, even by the church people, to be as respectable as a saloon could be. Handsome Anton Jelinek, who had rented his homestead and come to town, was the proprietor. In his saloon there were long tables where the Bohemian and German farmers could eat the lunches they had brought from home while they drank their beer. Jelinek kept rye bread on hand and smoked fish and strong imported cheeses to please the foreign palate. I liked to drop into his barroom and listen to the talk. But one day he overtook me on the street and clapped me on the shoulder. "Jim," he said, "I am good friends with you and I always like to see you. But you know how the church people think about saloons. Your grandpa has always treated me fine, and I don't like to have you come into my place, because I know he don't like it, and it puts me in bad with him." So I was shut out of that. One could hang about the drugstore and listen to the old man who sat there every evening talking politics and telling raw stories. One could go to the cigar factory and chat with the old German who raised canaries for sale and look at his stuffed birds. But whatever you began with him, the talk went back to taxidermy. There was the depot, of course. I often went down to see the night train come in, and afterwards sat a while with a disconsolate telegrapher who was always hoping to be transferred to Omaha or Denver, where there was some life. He was sure to bring out his pictures of actresses and dancers. He got them with cigarette coupons, and nearly smoked himself to death to possess these desired forms and faces. For a change, one could talk to the station agent, but he was another malcontent, spent all his spare time writing letters to officials requesting a transfer. He wanted to get back to Wyoming, where he could go trout fishing on Sundays. He used to say there was nothing in life for him but trout streams ever since he'd lost his twins. These were the distractions I had to choose from. There were no other lights burning downtown after 9 o'clock. On starlit nights, I used to pace up and down those long, cold streets, scowling at the little sleeping houses on either side with their storm windows and covered back porches. They were flimsy shelters, most of them poorly built, of light wood, with spindle porch posts horribly mutilated by the turning lathe. Yet, for all their frailness, how much jealousy and envy and unhappiness some of them managed to contain. The life that went on in them seemed to be made up of evasions and negations, shifts to save cooking, to save washing and cleaning, devices to propitiate the tongue of gossip. This guarded mode of existence was like living under a tyranny. People's speech, their voices, their very glances became furtive and repressed. Every individual taste, every natural appetite was bridled by caution. The people asleep in those houses, I thought, tried to live like the mice in their own kitchens, to make no noise, to leave no trace, to slip over the surface of things in the dark. The growing pile of ashes and cinders in the black yards were the only evidence that the wasteful, consuming process of life went on at all. On Tuesday nights, The Owl Club danced. Then there was a little stir in the streets, and here and there one could see a lighted window until midnight. But the next night all was dark again. After I refused to join the Owls, as they were called, I made a bold resolve to go to the Saturday night dances at Firemen's Hall. I knew it would be useless to acquaint my elders with any such plan. Grandfather didn't approve of dancing anyway. He would only say that if I wanted to dance, I could go to the Masonic Hall among the people that we knew. It was just my point that I saw altogether too much of the people we knew. My bedroom was on the ground floor, and as I studied there, I had a stove in it. I used to retire to my room early on Saturday night, change my shirt and collar, and put on my Sunday coat. I waited until all was quiet and the old people were asleep, then raised my window, climbed out, and went softly through the yard. The first time I deceived my grandparents, I felt rather shabby, perhaps even the second time, but I soon ceased to think about it. The dance at the Firemen's Hall was the one thing I looked forward to all the week. There I met the same people I used to see at the Vanny's tent. Sometimes there were Bohemians from Wilbur or German boys who came down on the afternoon freight from Bismarck. Tony and Lena and Tiny were always there, and the 3 Bohemian Marys and the Danish laundry girls. The 4 Danish girls lived with the laundryman and his wife in their house behind the laundry with a big garden where the clothes were hung out to dry. The laundryman was a kind, wise old fellow who paid his girls well, looked out for them, and gave them a good home. He told me once that his own daughter died just as she was getting old enough to help her mother, and that he had been trying to make up for it ever since. On summer afternoons, he used to sit for hours on the sidewalk in front of his laundry, his newspaper lying on his knee, watching his girls through the big open window while they ironed and talked in Danish. The clouds of white dust that blew up the street, the gusts of hot wind that withered his vegetable garden never disturbed his calm. His droll expression seemed to say that he had found the secret of contentment. Morning and evening he drove about in his spring wagon, distributing freshly ironed clothes and collecting bags of linen that cried out for his suds and sunny drying lines. His girls never looked so pretty at the dances as they did standing by the ironing board or over their tubs, washing the fine pieces, their white arms and throats bare, their cheeks bright as the brightest wild roses, their gold hair moist with the steam or the heat, and curling in little damp spirals about their ears. They had not learned much English and were not so ambitious as Tony or Lena, but they were kind, simple girls, and they were always happy. When one danced with them, one smelled their clean, freshly ironed clothes that had been put away with rosemary leaves from Mr. Jensen's garden. There were never girls enough to go around at those dances, but everyone wanted a turn with Tony and Lena. Lena moved without exertion, rather indolently, and her hand often accented the rhythm softly on her partner's shoulder. She smiled if anyone spoke to her, but seldom answered. The music seemed to put her into a soft, waking dream, and her violet-colored eyes looked sleepily and confidingly at one from under her long lashes. When she sighed, she exhaled a heavy perfume of sachet powder. To dance Home Sweet Home with Lena was like coming in with the tide. She danced every dance like a waltz, and it was always the same waltz, the waltz of coming home to something of inevitable, fated return. After a while, one got restless under it as one does under the heat of a soft, sultry summer day. When you spun out into the floor with Tony, you didn't return to anything. You set out every time upon a new adventure. I liked to Scottish with her. She had so much spring and variety, and was always putting in new steps and slides. She taught me to dance against and around the hard and fast beat of the music. If, instead of going to the end of the railroad, old Mr. Shimerda had stayed in New York and picked up a living with his fiddle, how different Antonia's life might have been. Antonia often went to the dances with Larry Donovan, a passenger conductor who was a kind of professional ladies' man, as we said. I remember how admiringly all the boys looked at her the night she first wore her velveteen dress, made like Mrs. Gardner's black velvet. She was lovely to see, with her eyes shining and her lips always a little parted when she danced. That constant dark color in her cheeks never changed. One evening when Donovan was out on his run, Antonia came to the hall with Norwegian Anna and her young man, and that night I took her home. When we were in the Cutter's yard, sheltered by the evergreens, I told her she must kiss me good night. "Why, sure, Jim." A moment later, she drew her face away and whispered indignantly, "Why, Jim, you know it ain't right to kiss me like that. I'll tell your grandmother on you." "Lena Lingard lets me kiss her," I retorted, "and I'm not half as fond of her as I am of you." "Lena does," Tony gasped. "If she up to any of her nonsense with you, I'll scratch her eyes out." She took my arm again, and we walked out of the cage and up and down the sidewalk. "Now don't you go and be a fool like some of these town boys. You're not going to sit around here and whittle store boxes and tell stories all your life. You are going away to school and make something of yourself. I'm just awful proud of you. You won't go and get mixed up with the Swedes, will you?" "I don't care anything about any of them but you," I said, "and you'll always treat me like a kid, I suppose." She laughed and threw her arms around me. "I expect I will. But you're a kid I'm awful fond of anyhow. You can like me all you want to. But if I see you hanging around with Lena Mach, I'll go to your grandmother as sure as your name's Jim Burden. Lena's all right, only, well, you know yourself, she's soft that way. She can't help it. It's natural to her." If she was proud of me, I was so proud of her that I carried my head high as I emerged from the dark cedars and shut the Cutter's gate softly behind me. Her warm, sweet face, her kind arms, and the true heart in her. She was still my Antonia. I looked with contempt at the dark, silent little houses about me as I walked home, and thought of the stupid young men who were asleep in some of them. I knew where the real women were, though I was only a boy, and I would not be afraid of them either. I hated to enter the still house when I went home from the dances, and it was long before I could get to sleep. Toward morning, I used to have pleasant dreams. Sometimes Tony and I were out in the country, sliding down straw stacks as we used to, climbing up the yellow mountains over and over, and slipping down the smooth sides into soft piles of chaff. One dream I dreamed a great many times, and it was always the same. I was in a harvest field full of shocks, and I was lying against one of them. Lena Lingard came across the stubble barefoot in a short skirt with a curved reaping hook in her hand, and she was flushed like the dawn, with a kind of luminous rosiness all about her. She sat down beside me, turned to me with a soft sigh, and said, "Now that they are all gone, and I can kiss you as much as I like." I used to wish I could have this flattering dream about Antonia, but I never did. Part 13. I noticed one afternoon the grandmother had been crying. Her feet seemed to drag as she moved about the house, and I got up from the table where I was studying and went to her, asking if she didn't feel well and if I couldn't help her with her work. No, thank you, Jim. I'm troubled, but I guess I'm well enough. Getting a little rusty in the bones, maybe, she added bitterly. I stood hesitating. What are you fretting about, grandmother? Has grandfather lost any money? No, it ain't money. I wish it was, but I've heard things. You must have known it would come back to me sometime. She dropped into a chair and, covering her face with her apron, began to cry. Jim, she said, I was never one that claimed old folks could bring up their grandchildren. But it came about so. There wasn't any other way for you, it seemed like. I put my arms around her. I couldn't bear to see her cry. What is it, grandmother? Is it the firemen's dances? She nodded. I'm sorry I sneaked off like that, but there's nothing wrong about the dances, and I haven't done anything wrong. I like all those country girls, and I like to dance with them. That's all there is to it. But it ain't right to deceive a son, and it brings blame on us. People say you are growing up to be a bad boy, and that ain't just to us. Well, I don't care what they say about me. But if it hurts you, that settles it. I won't go to the fireman's hall again. I kept my promise, of course, but I found the spring months dull enough. I sat at home with the old people in the evenings now, reading Latin. It was not in our high school course. I had made up my mind to do a lot of college requirement work in the summer and to enter the freshman class at the university without conditions in the fall. I wanted to get away as soon as possible. Disapprobation hurt me, I found, even that of people whom I did not admire. As the spring came on, I grew more and more lonely and fell back on the telegrapher and the cigar maker and his canaries for companionship. I remember I took a melancholy pleasure in hanging a May basket for Nina Harling that spring. I bought the flowers from an old German woman who always had more window plants than anyone else and spent an afternoon trimming a little work basket. When dusk came on and the new moon hung in the sky, I went quietly to the Harlings' front door with my offering, rang the bell, and then ran away as was the custom. Through the willow hedge I could hear Nina's cries of delight, and I felt comforted. On those warm, soft spring evenings, I often lingered downtown to walk home with Frances and talk to her about my plans and about the reading I was doing. One evening she said she thought Mrs. Harling was not seriously offended with me. Mama is as broad-minded as mothers ever are, I guess. But you know she was hurt by Antonia, and she can't understand why you like to be with Tiny and Lena better than with the girls of your own set. Can you? I asked bluntly. Frances laughed. Yes, I think I can. You knew them in the country, and you like to take sides. In some ways you're older than boys of your age. It will be all right with Mama after you pass your college examinations and she sees you're in earnest. If you were a boy, I persisted, you wouldn't belong to the Owl Club either. You'd be just like me. She shook her head. I would, and I wouldn't. I expect I know the country girls better than you do. You always put a kind of glamour over them. The trouble with you, Jim, is that you're a romantic. Mama's going to take your commencement. She asked me the other day if I knew what your oration is to be about. She wants you to do well. I thought my oration was very good. It stated with fervor a great many things I had lately discovered. Mrs. Harling came to the opera house to hear the commencement exercises, and I looked at her most of the time while I made my speech. Her keen, intelligent eyes never left my face. Afterward, we came back to the dressing room where we stood with our diplomas in our hands, walked up to me and said heartily, "You surprised me, Jim. I didn't believe you could do as well as that. You didn't get that speech out of books." Among my graduation presents, there was a silk umbrella from Mrs. Harling with my name on the handle. I walked home from the opera house alone. As I passed the Methodist church, I saw three white figures ahead of me, pacing up and down under the arching maple trees where the moonlight filtered through the lush June foliage. They hurried toward me. They were waiting for me. Lena and Tony and Anna Hansen. "Oh, Jim, it was splendid." Tony was breathing hard, as she always did when her feelings outran her language. "There ain't a lawyer in Blackhawk could make a speech like that. I stopped your grandpa and said so to him. He won't tell you, but he told us he was awful surprised himself, didn't he, girls?" Lena sidled up to me and said teasingly, "What made you so solemn? I thought you were scared. I was sure you would forget."